welcome to Week 13's edition of The KAEP. I'm your host, John Gillespie, and on The KAEP, guys, we have one promise and one promise only, and that is to make you a much smarter fantasy football player, yet a much dumber person. Guys, this episode we will break down Week 13's matchups. We will look ahead to Week 14. We will hand out our weekly awards, and as always, we will announce the playoff seeding and the playoff matchups. We're doing one episode this week, guys, so let's dive right in. But before we do, let's give a shout out to our producer, Peter. Thanks, Peter, for all that you do in making this podcast possible. And also to our sponsor, Chicken Milk. Unleash the power of the chicken today with Chicken Milk, the nation's #1 performance-enhancing supplement on the market. So guys, let's dive right in to our game of the week. Orange Crush versus Stafford Infection. Congratulations to Juan Guzman for the resounding victory, 131.3 over 108.5. This is all done in spite of the crushing Kareem Hunt news. He won 2 in a row without his stud running back. That's what earns him the game of the week this week. Juan, your top performer was Keenan Allen, 14 receptions, 148 yards, and a touchdown to the tune of 36.8 fantasy points. And for you, Garrett, your top performer was Travis Kelce, that monster himself, 12 receptions, 168 yards, and 2 touchdowns to the tune of 38.8 fantasy points. With the victory, Orange Crush improves to a league best 9-4, and with the loss, Garrett Rival falls to 5-8. Moving on to the next game on the tally, the Little Lamb versus the Chief. Congratulations to the Chief for pulling off the victory, 123.1 to 97.5, and not the radio station. Pedro, your top performer was none other, no surprises here, Todd Gurley, 132 yards and 2 touchdowns to the tune of 31.5 fantasy points. Guys, breaking news, Todd Gurley is good at football, #analysis. And for you, Ethan Lopez, your top performer was rolling with my homies, Patrick Mahomes himself. He only threw for 295 yards and 4 touchdowns to the tune of 33 fantasy points. With the victory, the Chief improves to 8-5, and with the loss, the Little Lamb falls to 7-6. Moving on to the next game on the tally, TNT versus the Dungeon Master. Congratulations to Ethan Taylor for pulling off the victory, 120.7 over 93.3. Ethan, your top performer was no surprise here as usual of late. Devontae Adams, 23.3 fantasy points on 8 catches for 93 yards and a touchdown. What else can you expect from Aaron Rodgers' #1 targets? And for you, Jonathan Walton, your top performer was DeAndre Hopkins, 7 catches for 91 yards to the tune of 16.1 fantasy points. With the victory, TNT improves to 7-6, and with the loss, the Dungeon Master falls to 7-6. Moving on to the next game on the tally, the Candyman versus the King of the North. Congratulations to you, Corbin, for pulling off the victory, 122.4 over 94.2. Corbin, your top performer was Tariq Cohen, 30 rushing yards, a passing touchdown, and a plethora of catches to the tune of 34.6 fantasy points. Guys, fun fact, Tariq Cohen is RB10 on the season, which means that he would qualify as an RB1 if the season ended today. Just ridiculous numbers by Tariq Cohen. And Kirk, your top performer was none other than Ben Roethlisberger, 281 yards and 2 touchdowns to the tune of 17.2 fantasy points. With the victory, Corbin improves to 8-6, and 5. And with the loss, the King of the North falls to 5 and 8. Moving on to the next game on the tally, ASW versus Lady Laxire herself. Congratulations to you, Riley, for pulling off the victory, 147.8 over 93.2. Riley, your top performer was Antonio Brown, 10 catches, 154 yards, and a touchdown to the tune of 31.4 fantasy points. And for you, Kamala, your top performer was, no surprise here, Zeke the Freak Elliott, 76 yards and a receiving touchdown to the tune of 25.6 fantasy points. With the loss, Lady Laxire falls to 5 and 8, and with the victory, ASW improves to 4 and 9. Last but not least, the final game on the tally, Lambeau Calrissian versus What's Cookin'. Congratulations to Lambeau Calrissian for pulling off the victory, 128.9 over 108.7. Lambeau Calrissian, your top performer, was, no surprise here, Run CMC, the Great White Hype, Christian McCaffrey, 106 on the ground with the receiving touchdown to the tune of 31.1 fantasy points. And Austin, your top performer was none other than Zach Ertz, 9 catches for 83 yards to the tune of 17.3 fantasy points. With the victory, winning 4 of his last 5 to close out the season, Lambeau Calrissian improves to 8 and 5, and with the loss, What's Cookin' falls to 6 and 7. Alright guys, that wraps up our weekly recap. Now let's move on to our weekly awards. Our start of the week goes to the Candyman for starting Tariq Cohen, 8 catches for 30 yards and 12 receptions for 156 yards to the tune of a ridiculous 34.6 fantasy points. What a flex option he is. Tariq Cohen qualifies as a super flex going forward. And our sit of the week goes to the Dungeon Master for sitting Russell Wilson. He threw for 185 yards and 4 touchdowns to the tune of 24.8 fantasy points. Alright guys, a look ahead to our Thursday night game is the Jacksonville Jaguars versus the Tennessee Titans. So that will kick off Wild Card Weekend in the PVFL. And speaking of Wild Card Weekend, our seeds have been finalized. So let's go ahead and announce our playoff matchups, starting off with the 1 seed. It'll be Orange Crush takes on What's Cookin'. That'll be an interesting game with Leonard Fournette coming back off of suspension, and Orange Crush, we all know he does not have Kareem Hunt. So that is anybody's game. That'll be a thriller. Then the next bracket is the 4 versus the 5, TNNT versus Lambeau Calrissian. That'll be a nail biter as well. Then we have the number 3 seed, the Little Lamb, taking on the Chief in a rematch of Week 13. And then finalizing the playoff weekend, we have the Candyman versus the Dungeon Master. So guys, we have some intriguing, thrilling matchups this week. So definitely, for all of you who did not make the playoffs, it was a great season, guys. We appreciate your efforts. There's always next year. Okay, so that wraps up our final episode of the KAEP for the 2018 season, guys. Starting next week, we will be recording exclusively Quest for the Cup and breaking down the PVFL playoffs. I am your host, John Gillespie, signing off for the final time, and I will see you on the other side.